Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Still Standing podcast, hosted by Daniela Galdi, the founder of Still Standing Together, a support and empowerment organization that helps you get back on your feet. The Still Standing podcast offers you interviews, guidance, and solutions through everyday struggles and mental health improvement.
Hey there, listeners. Thanks for coming back and joining us for an episode with Heather Parady of Unconventional Leaders. We'll learn more about finding your place in this world, practicing self-acceptance, quitting judgment, and carrying out your mission with others. Heather is the host of Unconventional Leaders, a top-ranked podcast which interviews leaders from all over the world who use their unique gifts to make an impact in this world. She has had the honor of interviewing names like Seth Godin and Jack Canfield, as well as the leaders you may have never heard of. There is always one common theme: action in the midst of fear. Professionally, Heather is a mental health therapist turned online entrepreneur where she has helped countless brands bring their services online in order to scale their impact. She has helped professionals with no email list hit 10,000 course launches and countless individuals shake off their fear and build and monetize top-ranked podcasts. Again, the common theme: action despite fear. Hey Heather, how are you? Thank you so much for doing this episode today.
It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited. And I was just saying, we were chatting a bit before this, that usually the tables are turned and you have interviewed me for your podcast, Unconventional Leaders. So I love that now I get to pick your brain and we get to hear your story about how you've gotten here and what your mission is, because I really just think that you have so much to offer. And it's been amazing, I have to tell you, to see how when we first met, which we've never even met in person, but I feel like, I know you already, but how we first met, and then just to see you take off in the way that you have is incredible. So I wanted to applaud you for that, but also I wanted you to share a little bit about what it is that you do.
Sure. So, well, thank you for saying that. I do want to be transparent that, sometimes when you see people, quote, take off, that there's always an internal dialogue with that person where they don't feel like they're where they want to be themselves. So people say that, and I really appreciate it. But two, I don't think any of us ever feel like we're making the kind of progress that we want to be making. And that's sometimes really discouraging for creatives, entrepreneurs, leaders, because they have so much vision and they want to do so many things. And when it's not going as fast as they want it to, sometimes it's easy to give up or be harder on yourself than you should be. So I just want to be transparent with that. What I do, I am a host of what you mentioned, the Unconventional Leaders podcast, and that's really my sole project. That's what I do everything else for. It's centered around that. A lot of people have podcasts to support their businesses, and I'm kind of opposite. I built a business in order to have time to podcast. So, professionally, I'm a mental health therapist turned online entrepreneur, and I help content creators spread their messages through content marketing strategies. I do that in a variety of ways, mostly through one-on-one coaching and consulting. I love that because I think there's a lot of really amazing people in the world who need their voices to be heard, and the internet is a perfect place to do that.
There's so much that I love in what you just said, especially the transparency. So thank you for that, because that is so tough. I read something the other day and it was about somebody was asked, how are they? And I know for myself too, when someone asks me that, or someone does say something in respect to what I'm doing with my career or my life passions, then it becomes, well, in our heads we start to race like, oh, but there's so many different things that we all still want for ourselves. And it's interesting how it comes out to the rest of the world. So I really appreciate you sharing that and acknowledging that for our listeners, because it's important. But I still applaud you, but I appreciate that. So let me ask you, because I've never gotten to hear about your story and how you got into the mental health field, and then how you began this love for podcasting. So can you take us back a little bit and just give us a bit more about that?
Sure. So I grew up without ever thinking that I would do anything. I, I grew up in an interesting circumstance, just a lot of family stuff, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. And then growing up where I didn't have an education. So I was, quote, homeschooled. And yet my mother dealt with a lot of mental health issues. And my dad left at one point and she had to go to work. And my education got put on the back burner. So last grade I remember attempting was sixth or seventh grade. And that was like, me cracking a book open. I would go to the library and like find books that I thought people my age might be reading and tried reading on my own. And that's like the level I was at. So going into any kind of career was just not an option in my mind. The only thing that I could think of that I could do with my life was to go into ministry or be a missionary or something like that. So when I was at graduating age, I went into a full time ministry school, and I was there for 2 years. Didn't necessarily work out. I didn't, long story, but didn't really want to do that. But somebody said to me, if you want to help people, you've got to get a skill set. So to me, when you think skill set, you think school. However, I was terrified of school because, again, I hadn't finished, basic math and science classes and stuff that people in college need. So I just dismissed that, and felt super, super inferior to that. Long story short, I ended up going and enrolling in a community college and taking developmental classes. And if those of you who don't know what that is, that pretty much means you pay for college, go to college, but you don't get college credit until you get up to a certain point where your grades are to a point where they can say, okay, well, you're smart enough now. We'll give you some college credit. Anyway, so the school journey was really interesting for me. Although I didn't end up doing what I intended to do when I went into school, it taught me that there's a lot to be said with grit, and that you may not have this or that you think you need, but determination carries you so much further than anything else. And so I started building a side business to support school when I was an undergrad and then through graduate school. And I fell in love with it. I love the idea of starting something from nothing. And I really love, business is a gateway drug into personal development. When I started reading personal development books and so forth, I was like, wow, most of the people who have done really awesome things in this world had a lot of adversity. They weren't educated, or they didn't have parents, or they were abused, or they were poor, or whatever, whatever, whatever. And usually they turned that adversity into something really powerful. And so, really, just an interest to study that. We started the show. I started that right around the time grad school was ending, to a point where I just fell in love with it. I loved what I was doing. I loved the content. I loved the business, and decided that even after getting my master's and getting a couple of job offers and my license, to make the very difficult decision to turn all of that down and go the unconventional path and see what I could build on my own. And I kind of went into it with the mindset of, this may totally fail, but if I don't try, go all in for a few years, I'll always wonder what if, and I could always go back to that career if I need to. The degrees are still sitting in my closet, and the funny thing is I thought I needed them. I thought I needed some kind of validation to overcome my own insecurity of inadequacy. But even after achieving what I thought was unachievable for me, I still had to face my own inner demons. That it wasn't the paper that made me feel inferior. It was my own inner talk and my own dialogue that made me feel inferior. And if I could figure out how to heal inwardly and be enough for myself, then really the sky was the limit of what I could achieve. And that's still a work in progress. It's not something that I dealt with a few years ago and just have overcome. It's something that I've faced continually. And I think we all do, especially as we, reach certain milestones. There's always another level of insecurity and self-doubt. But we have to acknowledge that that's something that's something within, and it's not necessarily something external, although we would like to displace it and make it be external.
Yeah, no, I completely can relate with that. And I think I know our listeners can as well. What's so amazing from what you just shared, and I know there's probably so many different avenues that brought you to this place where you are still, growing and doing that personal development for yourself. But what's so amazing, Heather, is that you were able to really tap into those innate abilities and take that with you to carry out other missions that you had. So, with that in mind, and keeping in mind too, this is why I really could not wait for you to come on and talk with us about your perspective on self acceptance and how we can better self accept ourselves and how we can find our place in this world. What I want to ask you, if you can kind of go back for me and just think about what tools or what did you do you remember anything sticking out to you that really helped you to get over that hurdle of feeling inadequate?
I think submersing myself in other people's stories. Story is so powerful because we see ourselves in story. And so learning about, these people that I held on such a high pedestal. Let me give you an example. So when I first started listening to podcasts, I listened to Lewis Howes' The School of Greatness. And I was just like, he is so much better than me. He has such a huge audience, blah, 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 all the things. And then I rewound to episode 1, his very first episode. And I started doing that with other influencers, leaders, people I really admired. It would take me a long time, but going through to the very first YouTube channel, going to the very first podcast, reading the very first blog, and they were terrible. And we put such dissonance between us and the people that we admire without understanding their journey and realizing that it is a journey. And so I think going back to those backstories is really important because there's this concept in psychology called modeling. And we want to be able to see where somebody not only has where they're going, but also where they've been because we want to see ourselves in it. So that renews this sense of hope. Also, there's just this immersion that you almost have to get yourself into. No matter what industry it is, you have to immerse yourself with the kind of person that you want to be, almost to an obsessive point where you're constantly reading, you're constantly listening to podcasts. Because when there's a habit that's formed in your mind, it's not just a matter of making up your mind and it being over. It's rewiring those neurological connections, and that takes time, especially when they've been there for years and years and years. So first of all, recognizing that these are unhealthy behaviors and figuring out small little ritual habits to slowly start to unravel those, giving yourself some grace through it. But I think putting in ritual in your life is so important. And even if it's something small, like, okay, 30 minutes a day, I'm going to listen to this podcast, or, instead of on the treadmill, me listening to music, I'm going to listen to affirmations or something like that. It's hard at first, but eventually that becomes your lifeline. And even now, when I feel I'm probably at one of the most confident levels that I've been in my life, not fully confident, but in a way healthier place than I've ever been, I still have those rituals in place. Like this morning, I ran and listened to 5 podcasts, 5 different episodes while I was running. And I didn't do that because it's cute and fun and interesting. I did that because I need it, because in order to maintain this kind of energy level and do the kind of work that I need to do, I've got to make that a priority.
I was going to ask you about the running and the rituals because I know that you do enjoy running and working out. And I was going to ask if that plays a big part in your rituals. But do other things play a big part in your rituals outside of developing your skill set or familiarizing yourself with the industry itself?
Yeah, so recently I've been adamant on allowing creative space in as well, just for kind of an expression piece where I can feel like I can play a little bit more with my work. And I was just sharing this with someone else who has like a kind of more of a rigid entrepreneurial podcast. And I'm like, it's hard sometimes as leaders because there's such a to-do list to allow space in our life to express and create and play. So over the past year, I've been making that a ritual in my life too, like, taking acting classes or reading a fiction piece that I wouldn't normally normally read, going outside and doodling on paper, even though I'm not an artist at all. Sometimes that may seem a little bit trivial, but I think it's really important to introduce those pieces into our life, because when you think about impact and making a real difference through your work, I believe really the baseline of all that is this creative flow. And sometimes we block that out because it's, we feel guilty, like we want to be a little bit more productive. And I'm type A and struggle with that a lot. But I've noticed that my personal growth, my joy is an important topic. My joy has just increased the more I've allowed space for those kind of rituals.
That's really beautiful. I love that. It's interesting because I hope that our listeners do that and and acknowledge that they're doing that so they can add that creative space into their lives even more. And I say that because I actually did that the other day. I drew a
Good.
picture for a friend. Yeah, and I thought, um, to be honest, I didn't want to go to the store to get a card, so I drew a picture instead. And I thought back to a time when I used to draw a lot more, and I just felt so much relief from it. And so I'm glad that you're pointing it out, that you make space for it and you make time for that, so that people can actually acknowledge and be like, oh no, this is important. It needs to be, like you're saying, it needs to be a ritual.
Absolutely.
And so I want to ask you, we are going to get into the self talk thing because I'm also huge. It really does come down to changing those thoughts in our brains. But I want to get to that a little bit later in the podcast. What I really want to ask you right now is, if you could define your mission, what would that be? And I'm going to give you a two-parter to this. I don't like to do this, but what would that mission be? And what do you do to conquer comparison when you're diving into that mission and trying to live it, execute it, and share it with the world?
Sure. Mission is to raise up unconventional leaders to step up, use their voice, and make an impact in this world. As I mentioned earlier, I felt really inferior. And we can flip that to say, okay, I have empathy and understand deeply what it feels like to come from that space. And so that's made me very defensive and championing. Man, that's a hard word. Championing. Is that a word? I don't know. I need to that.
Champion. That's a hard word.
Mhm. Being a champion of those who feel less than. I bullies, people who put each other down. I get hot. I get very, very angry because that was my story. And I think we need to pay attention to what makes us fiery, because what sets you off is not going to set me off. And we can steer that towards what Alfred Adler calls societal good, which I think is really cool. So that's my mission. I want to champion the underdog and give them voice and encourage them to step into their calling, what I believe is a calling on their life. As far as comparison goes, comparison, I struggle with that when I get my eyes off of the mission and other people and put it on myself, where and then it happens. It's I would say impossible. I would say it's impossible to not ever struggle with selfish ambition, especially when you're an ambitious person. It feels good getting a lot of downloads. It feels good getting a lot of likes. It feels good getting emails saying you're awesome. This is, and it's really, even at a small scale, because I'm at a small scale, it could get to your head a little bit. And that's where comparison creeps in, because we get addicted to that approval and that affirmation. And when we see other people getting that, it's like it's taking away from ours. And so, really finding your true source. Where does my validation come from? Where does my worth come from? Is that, again, an internal thing or an external thing? So I know when I struggle with that I've got to immerse myself back in the empathy piece of who I'm trying to serve and why I'm trying to serve them. Because at that point, it doesn't matter as much when other people succeed. In fact, I'm happy for it, because if I'm in it for people, I'm going to be thrilled when you impact people, because my mission is people and not myself. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's very refreshing to hear because it takes away all of the extra noise that I think can, even outside of anyone who is having or suffering from mental health difficulties, it just takes away from negative emotions. It at least helps us to feel more relief from them, things like insecurities or anger or resentment. I can tell you too, there are some days where I'm feeling really confident, and then what trips me up is when I'm not seeing the results. And you do
Oh,
have to back up. Oh yeah, absolutely. And you do have to back yourself up and think about, like, why are you doing this? So do you have any advice for people on how to find their why? We've been doing a lot of work this month, I'll tell you, on things like purpose and creating your purpose, as well as overcoming past traumas. So do you have any advice for people in search of their why?
in search of their why, I think you need to pay really close attention to the thing that always comes up for you without effort. I think our why, our purpose, our mission is way more obvious and unsexy than we want it to be. I had two calls this past week, two different people, two different issues, and they both said the exact same thing to me. They said, I want to make such an impact in this world, and I have notebooks and notebooks of ideas, and I just feel so overwhelmed with it all that I don't know what to do. There was just this lack of clarity, and there was such turmoil. And I said to them both, and something that I have to remind myself over and over again as a visionary is, well, look at what is in your hand and be faithful with that and think as practically and tiny, tiny step as possible. It takes a lot of pressure off, but it's also disappointing because we want things to be a little bit more elaborate and sexy and fun and adventurous. But the truth is, real life and real impact really isn't that. It's a whole bunch of small, deliberate moments and acts of obedience to a higher power of, like, okay, this is the next step, and not judge it. We judge things so much, like, oh, it should be this, I should be that. Should is just crap. Like, what is the very small step in front of you? What is the thing that comes back to you over and again? What do you think about all the time? What brings you joy? What is your story? And I think we could honestly sit down and within a few minutes answer that question honestly, but we second guess it. We go back in and we nitpick it and micromanage everything, where everything that we just said of, you know what, I really have a heart for children and I love drawing cartoons and creating, and I didn't have a relationship with my mom, and it's really important to me to connect with kids because I never really had that. But then we go back in and we're like, you know what, that I need to have, that doesn't, I need a bit, like that doesn't, wasn't clear enough. What children? Coloring, drawing, maybe that's too ridiculous. Maybe I should reach parents. And we go back and we just rip apart everything that we just honestly said from our heart. And instead, what if we just looked at that for what it was and just like, you know what, that's enough. That's good enough for right now. And one of my other favorite quotes is, action creates clarity. So, back to that example, I have a heart for children, and it stems from this broken relationship with my mom, and I love drawing cartoons. Maybe that's all you need to know for right now. Maybe that's it. Quit judging it. Maybe you can just start taking action on that and drawing cartoons and sending them to little kids that you know in your at your church or in your neighborhood. And through that, action creates clarity. What's going to happen is you're going to start getting feedback, not only from the people that you're serving, but also from yourself. Does this feel good? Does this feel right? And those creative processes start flowing, which gives you more ideas of different things that you can do. But none of that would happen if we judged that original intent because it wasn't well thought out enough. And then if we stalled and waited to take action immediately on these small little tasks, oh, it's just handing a kid a picture in my neighborhood. That's no big deal. That's not making an impact. That's not being a leader. And yet I was faithful with that, which again, stirred my creativity, stirred my mind, stirred my confidence to think about maybe something else that I can do. And if anything else, you made that kid's day. So I know it's like a silly response to that, but I just want to encourage people to just stop overthinking impact and making a difference. Getting a ton of likes on something is not impacting the world, period. When you can move one person, that's impact.
I just had chills from that. It's really uplifting and motivating to hear you be able to speak with such confidence. And I understand, we have our own things that creep up from time to time, but I love the conviction that you're able to say things like leader and visionary and talk about yourself so highly, because I think that the communication of how we are exchanging words about ourselves, not only in our own minds, but also to other people, is so impactful on this idea of self-acceptance. So now let's talk a little bit more about that talking portion.
It is time to reflect and take out those journals. You heard Heather speak on judging ourselves. What are some ways you are judging yourself or your work? How can we change that so we can speak about ourselves more highly? What are the words you want to use to describe you and your work?
When we get down to how we talk about ourselves to others,
Hmm.
was there a time in your life where you felt like that was going to change or that needed to change, or you caught yourself not speaking highly of yourself and it didn't match up with what you were feeling?
Oh man, you would not have known me 10 years ago. You would be in shock. And I mean every word of that with all the emphasis. Like I was not this way. When I was growing up, I remember kneeling down on the couch with my mom and crying and praying, literally praying at the bottom of my couch, Lord, please let me have a friend because I had no one and I was so afraid of people. And there was a big isolation piece to that because, again, we were kept from home and shielded from people. But I was terribly bullied growing up, so much to a point that it was physical, um, and I had no friends, literally. And that coupled with all this stuff with my parents and abuse with that, I had a terrible, terrible view of myself. Stuff that I'm still unraveling and discovering today. I mean, there's still things that pop up in my life where I get really resistant and I have a lot of insecurity and doubt. And I'm like, where the hell is this coming from? And I have to do some work and be like, dude, that was, something back in the day that you don't even remember. These things impact our lives. In fact, this morning, I'm an avid journaler. I'm a big proponent of journaling, and I've been journaling for the past 14-ish years, I believe. And part of my ritual is not only journaling, but I also read a journal from years past, well, not every day, but several times a week. And I think that's a really important thing because I want to remember where I came from, and I want to remember parts of my past that I may have forgotten. And this morning, it was 2016, 2000. No. I wasn't married yet. That's wrong. 2006. That's what it was. 2006. Um, the hatred that was written on that page towards myself is unreal. You would not believe the things I was saying on that page. I was talking about how um, I was grew up in a really religious environment and I was struggling with like purity stuff with my boyfriend and all of that. Like let's just get real here. And I was writing on the page about how I knew I was going to go to hell and God has turned his face from me and I hate who I am and I can, I'm this and I'm that. And I just disgust myself and I mean, like terrible things. And it just made me so sad because I want to go back to that girl and be like, yo, like, first of all, let me give you a big hug. But dude, I hated myself. How to your original question? Yes, I've dealt with that. Changing the self-talk again, that goes back to those neurological pathways. It takes a lot of time. um I Affirmations are interesting because in school we learned, I studied mental health, that sometimes there's dissonance between our identity and what we're saying to ourselves. So affirmations are interesting because if you think like let's say I struggled with feeling fat. Okay. And I said to myself, I am skinny, I'm healthy, I love my body, blah, blah, blah. But let's say I really didn't. Sometimes saying that to yourself, what you'll do is you'll create a dialogue in your head and say right after you say, I love my body, you'll say all the reasons why you don't. So, well, I don't love my body because of this and this and this. And what that happens is you actually end up reaffirming that negative thought. So affirmations are interesting because you have to be careful with them, that you use them correctly, because sometimes they can be a tool against you where they make you argue with yourself and then
Mm.
affirm that negativity. So be careful with that. Um, I would say if you can't say affirmation, which I'm a proponent of them now, because now I understand that I can use emotion. Emotion's really important. Like, you don't just say things; you have to attach emotion to it for it to actually change your brain. If I can't gather that emotion within myself, and I know that if I say this affirmation that I'm just going to argue with, um, that's a little bit more tricky. I'm a big proponent of energy, and I really resisted that for several years because it sounded too hokey pokey. But the more I'm digging into it, the more scientific and real that it is to me, and putting myself around the right energy. Because sometimes whenever you're at like a low vibration and you're really struggling, sometimes the only strength that you have is just to go sit yourself in the right environment, I guess. And that's why, again, I'm a proponent of immersing myself in knowledge and other people, because I think if I were to be left alone, I couldn't do it by myself. Your circle is huge. The music you listen to is huge. I know that's weird, but I've even noticed, like, paying attention to how things make you feel. You know what I mean? Like, when I watch this, how do I feel after? And it could be something like as simple as, like, I watched a little short film earlier today, and I felt so gross after it. And it had nothing to do with anything, but I was just like, oh, that just brought my spirits so down. And when you're dealing with a lot of mental health stuff, and like, honor that, like, don't judge yourself with it, like, say, I can't watch that, I can't submerge myself in that. This platform is making me, I have a friend who just deleted Instagram, and she's a business owner, and she has a podcast, and that's crazy. Why would you ever do that? But for her own mental health, like, she made that sacrifice, and what's going to happen is she's going to show up differently with different energy in other places. So, again, back to that judgment piece, do what's right for you. Put yourself around the right energy, and know that we all deal with it. Every person you admire, every person you think who has it all together, struggles with their own inner demons, struggles with self worth. I do every single day. I know that I will continue to do that. We're all on our own paths and journey, and none of us really see the real stuff going on.
What I love is that you full circle brought it around to this, we'll use the word holistic. So, whole being, taking into account everything, our physical body, our energies, things like that. And I love that that is what your response to that question was, because it's not, while yes, the self talk is so important. I'm glad that you pointed that out to our listeners, that everything, all the pieces have to be working in conjunction with that self talk. It's interesting, Heather, because you mentioned about the physical, right? And I've been researching a lot on smiling, because when I do any
Oh,
mindfulness work, yes. And so it's like, you can be smiling, but if you associate it with the feeling, right? I'm sure you're familiar with this. If you associate it with the negative feeling, it becomes the response to a negative emotion,
yep.
in a nutshell. So I've been researching that, and it's interesting because when you break it down like you did, and you think about the physical, you think about, and I'm glad you gave an actual, like, physical response, like the I am fat, if that's what you're saying to yourself, because you can look back on pictures and be like, I mean, I know I do this. I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I have looked back on pictures and I've thought, I felt so bad about myself then, and when I look back,
Yes.
I look healthy, I look strong, I look like
Yes.
someone who
Me
took care,
too.
yeah. So I'm glad that you use that, because we have that to look back on. But and something that I'm working on myself, but I also know the power of it. And at times it's hard for me to do it because I'm afraid to confront what's going to come out. But the journaling piece, that is
Mm,
something that you mentioned that's so important, that I think no one's ever really mentioned, is about going back and looking at that, because that's our pictures. That's our looking back and thinking, like, wow, how did I feel that I was, so I'm so glad that you brought it to this whole holistic aspect of the physical, of the self-talk, the mind, and then also with the energy. And I'll share with you, it's funny. Growing up, I was a dancer, and modern or contemporary dance was very big, where I danced and learned. And so I fortunately been able to have that awareness, have that have that spiritual awareness, have that energy awareness, because I've had to work on it my entire life
right.
through that craft. And at times I find myself letting go of it until I hear something like this, where everybody is becoming more aware of the energy, and I'm like, oh right, I have to remember that, like, the shows we watch or the people I'm near, I don't feel good after that, or I do feel good after that, and I want more of that person. Not to drain them, but you know what I mean. Like, you know who you gravitate towards. So I don't know if you've realized that, but I just think I wanted to point that out for our listeners too, about how we went into it about self talk, but you are saying, like, it encompasses everything to make sure that those feelings really match up to your affirmations and what you're saying to yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that was one of the frustrations I had as a therapist, was that there wasn't more of a holistic. There was, I mean, it's the industry is changing a lot. People are becoming more vocal, but as far as like from the academic standpoint, there's not a lot of training from the holistic perspective. And we are holistic beings. And so sometimes if you think about, let's say you're really struggling. Okay, like I deal with a lot of anxiety because I'm a big picture person and stressed out all the time. So I've over the past couple of years, there was a time where like I was having trouble sleeping at night. I couldn't breathe, like all this crazy stuff. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my God, I've got to get rid of this anxiety and this is so hard, blah, blah, blah. And I'm so fixated on it. What happens is through that fixation, there's a lot more of attention put on it, which ends up affecting so many other parts of my life. So kind of more of a strengths based approach, which I really love, is thinking about, okay, well, what's something that's going well right now in my life, and figuring out how to add more of that, and how to maybe address something that's a little bit easier that you may think that is unrelated, and get better at it. So for me, what that was running. So I've always been a runner. I've been doing that for years, but I never used it like as a coping tool to deal with anxiety. So I knew that I was already running. So I put more intention on that. And what's interesting is, since we are holistic beings, the more water I started drinking because I was running, I think that had to do with it. I was eating a little bit better because it gave me more energy to run. And so all these other micro decisions started changing because of something that I was leaning into that I enjoyed and was my strength, which in fact does affect my anxiety. And so if you're dealing with something, perhaps think of something else that's maybe a physical thing, or maybe you're dealing with a physical thing and you want to work on a mental thing. The cool thing is no matter what you work on within a health space, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, whatever it may be, whatever the thing you pick, it's going to improve the other areas. It's going to, because it's all linked. And so that should take some pressure off of you, that you don't have to fixate on fixing that one thing, but think about how you can incorporate more healthy habits in other areas that might be more fun for you. And it might take some time. It probably will, but you will see the effects of it.
You're speaking on so many points that might not make sense to people, and you're able to break it down so well. And
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for that. I mean, every time I do an episode, and people who listen will probably hear me say this over and over again, it's almost as though I'm speaking with the people I'm meant to speak with. So I hope that whoever is able to listen, it's at the exact time that they need to hear what you're saying. So I can't thank you enough for that. And we have a few more minutes. So I just want to tap into unconventional leaders and connections that you've made, and how it's lifted you up in your mission to make an impact, and how you hope that it lifts other people up.
So going back to what we talked about earlier with modeling, and how important it is to see people who have been through what you've been through look like how you look, you know, I can speak to a certain audience who can relate to me and my story, but other people won't. They're like, I don't relate to that. That doesn't necessarily move me. And that doesn't mean that my story and my impact is any less valid. It just is meant for certain people. And so for me, sharing a variety of unconventional stories, my hope is to provide an example and a model to those who might feel, again, like the underdog, like someone who doesn't have what it takes. But through sharing story, we can say, okay, well, here is this person who dealt with an alcoholic dad and still was and ended up being an incredible father, and now has a nonprofit for fathers, or somebody who grew up in poverty, and yet they are now a CEO of a super successful company. Seeing people who look like us, and just hearing their story about how they overcame it, it gives us not only a model, but also just renews our hope that our circumstances don't define us. I know that's a very cliche statement, but it's so true because that's something that we always limit ourselves with. But I'm this, but I'm that. Well, yeah, but also too in the Bible, whether you agree with it or not, it says, he uses the weak to shame the strong. And I think that's a powerful statement, regardless of your religious standpoint, because often what we see as a weakness and an inferiority ends up becoming our connector with other people. It sets us apart and gives us leverage to make a real difference in this world.
It's incredible. You have spoken with a lot of incredible people, and I just want to know if there is a specific story that stands out that you'd like to share.
No, there isn't. Well, I mean that because everyone's story is so cool. I will say that there's an overwhelming, overarching theme to all of it where everyone deals with exactly what you've been talking about today, this inferiority, this negative self talk, this doubt, all of that. Not a person I've talked to has not dealt with that. And it's fascinating to me because I get so intimidated sometimes talking to these people. And then when you really hear them, they're just human, like I am human and like you are human. And again, we put such dissonance between us and quote successful people when really they just made different choices. And you and I can make different choices today as well.
It's beautiful, and I have to say I'm glad that you made the successful comment because I would eliminate that word from the dictionary for more reasons than one. I think it puts a lot of pressure, and in our own ways, I think we're all successful and the deserving. When we hear, "Oh, you so deserve that," it almost angers me because I'm like, "Oh, everybody deserves that."
Well, I agree with Gary Vaynerchuk. He says that we should gauge success off happiness. So, did you wake up happy today? Are the decisions that you're making you happy? You know, it's so funny to me all the debates that people get in. I have a leadership group, and I'm a part of several entrepreneurial groups. People get fiery. They're like, "You should do this. You should do that." Blah blah blah. And I'm like, the first question that we should be asking ourselves is, "What is my goal? What is my vision? What is my intention?" And base our decisions around that and our own happiness. That you know what if I am a stay at home mom and I love it, you are so successful because you're happy doing what you're doing. You don't have to have Instagram followers. You don't have to be making money on the side. You don't have to be doing because you're happy. Now, on the flip side of that, if you are super ambitious and you love achieving and you love going after goals, there's a lot of shaming around that. Well, you should rest more. You should blah, blah, blah. You should take days off. You should, but maybe they're happy. Maybe they love doing what they do. So instead of like judging each other and judging ourselves of what everybody should be doing, like let's just acknowledge what makes you happy is going to make not make me happy and vice versa. We're all unique and we're all on our own paths. And just to let up a little bit, like it doesn't matter. Success, I agree with Gary Vaynerchuk. Success is just being in integrity and alignment with what brings you joy, what makes you happy to wake up every morning.
That's such a refreshing perspective. I'm glad that you shared that. Thank you so much. So, we're coming down to the end, Heather. And in every episode that we release, we ask our guest, and by we, I mean me, I ask my guest to share going back to that self-talk piece. And I know this might be a little tricky given that we spoke about sharing affirmations that the affirmation really needs to resonate with the feelings. But if there's something, an affirmation or some sort of verbal practice or anything you can just leave our listeners with to keep them moving forward and staying resilient and working on that self-acceptance piece.
Sure. So I think environment is really cool. And, we spend, especially right now, we spend most of our time at home. And I was listening to an interview with Lo, I think, and they were like, how are you so confident? How are you blah blah? She said, I have the most positive house ever. Like everywhere and it's easy to look at somebody like her who's super successful and beautiful and all the things and think like, oh, she must have all this stuff down. But what she said is, she said, I have intentionally created an environment to cultivate positivity within me, because it's a battle with even her mind as well. And so even her pillows have positive sayings on them, and she has notes written on her walls. And everything is super, super intentional, that I'm going to create an environment that brings joy and life to me. Because when we try to just trust ourselves to muster the courage and the confidence, that's not something that you grind out and something that you just force yourself into. It's something that you allow into your life through intention. So, what is your environment saying to you right now? When's the last time that you brought in joy? Opening a freaking window. I know that sounds so lame and whatever, but sitting here in this office can get so, oh my gosh, I spend so much time here, and it's draining. Opening my windows and bringing light in here and having fresh flowers, and every hour I try to, for 10 to 5 minutes, get up and walk around and do something completely different, and just allow life into your life. Like, where are you bringing life into your space and into your environment? We, again, like I said at the very beginning, we overlook these super small things because we want something kind of big and miraculous and all that. But our lives are just made up of all these tiny micro moments. And I love what Oprah was saying on a podcast yesterday. She says, all we have is right now. So look around you right now. What is around you? How can you breathe life into this moment?